All right, welcome. There's some folks joining right now, but we are going to go ahead and get started. I'm Sky David. I'm the staff attorney at NCCASA. This is my colleague, Brian Lewis. We work together on policy for NCCADV and NCCASA. I'll turn it over to Kathleen.
Hi, I'm Kathleen Lockwood. I'm the policy director at NCCADV, and Carrie Ann is also here. If you want to just briefly introduce yourself, Carrie Ann, and then we can hand it back over to Sky.
Good afternoon. I'm Carrie Ann Fisher. I'm the executive director of NCCADV, and I'd like to welcome you all today and thank you to all of you and to New Frame for all your important work during this legislative session, and really excited to hear what you have to share.
All right, without further ado, we are going to just highlight where we're at in session. We'll start there, and then we're going to move into our joint efforts. That's NCCASA and NCCADV, some appropriations work that we did together this year, and then kind of go into our individual legislative agendas and where we're at. So to kick us off, the 2021 legislative session. I'll start by saying we're supposed to still be in the 2021 legislative session right now. Each legislative session is a 2-year biennium, and generally you adjourn that first year and then come back in the even numbered year for your short session, but technically we are still in the long session of 2021.
So we thought we would start off just for anyone who is participating in this webinar. We wanted to kind of explain where we are as far as partisanship goes inside the General Assembly, just so you have an understanding, especially as we're talking about Republicans and Democrats. First, the legal disclaimer: both organizations are 501c3 organizations. So the information I'm giving to you are just facts. I'm not rooting for one party or rooting against the other party. I'm simply stating, or we're simply stating, that this is who is in control of the General Assembly, and it really shapes the way we execute a strategy within the General Assembly. So first, let's start with the North Carolina House. For those of you who remember Political Science 101 from college, if you've took Political Science 101, we have 2 chambers in the General Assembly, the House and the Senate. Both chambers have to agree on any policy before it becomes law. So in the North Carolina House, there are 51 Democrats and 69 Republicans. In the North Carolina Senate, there are 22 Democrats and 28 Republicans. Now, let me be clear. Because of this majority that Republicans have in both chambers, that means Republicans control the entire agenda. They decide what bills are going to go to what committee, and if those bills go to that committee, whether those bills are going to be heard or not. If they're successful in committee, they ultimately decide if they're coming to the House or the Senate floor. So everything really is controlled by the Republican Party as it pertains to the General Assembly and whether they advance policy or not advance policy. I'd also like to point out that the governor does have a defensive tool. Governor Roy Cooper here, he's in the image. Basically, he can veto legislation that he disapproves of. And he has enough Democrats in both the House and the Senate to sustain his veto. So we saw him use this veto. He's used it during his tenure 70 some times, right?
16 times. Oh, this session.
No, since the biennium.
Yeah,
I mean, since he became governor. So he has a good track record of being able to hold a veto. However, it doesn't mean that his legislation that he wants, Medicaid expansion, necessarily gets to a House or Senate vote. It means he can stop things from becoming law that he disapproves of. This session, this past session, he vetoed 16 bills. There was some gun legislation. There were some things around election law that he disapproved of, and he gave a veto. And as I pointed out in the earlier slide, he has a perfect track record of being able to hold those vetoes.
This year, the chambers did pass a budget, and before the governor announced that he was going to sign the budget, it was looking like he was going to be overridden, that some Democrats had peeled off. And we'll talk about that some when we talk about the direct appropriations that weren't specifically from NCCADV or NCCASA. There were some small direct appropriations to communities, and we'll kind of talk about how that was used during the negotiation process to ensure that they would have the votes to enact a budget. All right. Brian's going to depart. All right, we're going to move into our NCCASA legislative priorities for this biennium. Number one priority is Rape Crisis Center funding. That's going to be our priority until we get to a place where we feel comfortable. This is our highest priority. Number two, rape kit funding. We needed an additional $9 million for testing backlog kits. That I'll go into why we needed that additional $9 million in a bit. 3, child marriage. And that's something both organizations worked on. 4, updating parental termination statutes. This is for federal guidelines. For us to be able to get state money, our statutes need to comply with those federal guidelines. And then 5 is SANE resources. That is something that was covered at the very beginning of session, and we'll talk through where we're at in that stage. To start, and Kathleen, please feel free to chip in here. Jointly, NCCADV and NCCASA asked for a one-time appropriation of $15 million to be split between programs. So $7.5 million domestic violence, 7.5 to sexual assault. And this was during the budget process. We saw different numbers as this moved through the process. And again, it was a joint effort. So we asked for that to be equal between the two organizations and between the different agencies. And so the Senate budget came out, gave us that $15 million. That was not included in the House budget. And then, as you'll see here, it says trilateral negotiations. So the House leadership, or the budget writers, and the Senate budget writers, 3 or 4 people who really do most of the legwork on the budget, met with the governor's budget folks and worked out some final details. And so in that final budget, we did get $15 million, and that is a grant program for DVSA. It also provided $4.8 million, and that's going to be in 2022, so the second year of the budget. I'll back up here and say the budget wasn't passed until November, so the budget year starts on July 1st, so a few months late, and it was a very, very, very long budget process this year with a lot of big periods of time where absolutely nothing was happening. It was just closed door meetings, and nobody really knew what was going on. The speaker would announce that we expected to have a budget negotiation deal next week. And so your hopes would get up, there was a deal next week, and then nothing. So it was a really long process. So that money is getting ready to be distributed right now. Because that happened in November, what happens after there is a budget, it has to be certified. So the budget is ratified, and that's when it passes both chambers. And then it has to be certified by the Office of State Budget Management. And then all of the agencies, let's say public instruction, transportation, those big agencies have to look at that and certify their budgets as well. So that takes a little bit of time to get all of that done before you have a budget and that money can be distributed. So because of that, there is a little bit of a delay, but then that 2022 budget will start on July 1st. And in 2022, it does provide that $4.8 million for facility improvements at agencies. So whatever your facility improvements may be, that will be something that you will get more information on as it comes. And both domestic violence and sexual assault agencies got a total increase each. So domestic violence got a total increase of $500,000 in each year of the biennium for a total of $1 million, and sexual assault got the same. So that was it was a great funding year for both domestic violence and sexual assault. I'll pause here in case Kathleen wants to jump in, or if anybody has questions about the funding for this year.
I'm going to go a little bit more into some of the direct funding that Sky mentioned in my presentation specific to domestic violence. But one thing to add, just while we're talking about what both coalitions were able to accomplish, is just emphasizing what Sky has said about what a good outcome this is for sexual assault and domestic violence funding. And hopefully we can use this to build momentum for continued recognition and financial appreciation, if you will, from the legislature for each of these services. So over the next year or two, please pay attention if we reach out for any requests for kind of information about how the funding was spent, good stories, like as you're spending this money, if something really impactful is being done with the money that we are not already aware of, please let us know, because this is the information that legislators will use to build the momentum for more funding in the future.
Yeah, that's a great point. This is a launch pad for us to get more funding every year. I will say that that bullet that says both domestic violence and sexual assault got that increase, that's a recurring increase. So from now on, each domestic violence and sexual assault are going to get that $500,000 increase from here going forward, unless something were to happen and there were cuts. So that is now a line item in the budget that's not going to change. That 15 million and that 4.8 million, those are one-time appropriations. So if something happens where it makes a huge difference in your agency, do tell us so that we can share that, and then legislators can be impacted by that as well, and they will want to continue to fund us at a higher level. Thanks for bringing that up, Kathleen. For rape crisis centers, as I noted, that $15 million, the $500,000 in each year. So that brings our total appropriation to $3.4 million in each year of the biennium. And as far as a direct appropriation, there was a direct appropriation in the budget of $125,000 to Cumberland County's Rape Crisis Center, and that is for training SANE nurses. So if you'll recall a few slides ago, we talked about SANEs there. Cumberland County, their hospital program there said that they did not have any certified SANE nurses, and this was way back when. They followed up on that and said that they had some, but this will train SANE nurses in Cumberland County for the area, and we should get some data back on that. And the reason this went to Cumberland County is twofold. One, because they were the target of the Carolina Public Press, digging into SANE nurses and the shortage across the state. Also, the second reason that Cumberland County specifically got an appropriation is because of what Brian said earlier about the governor. All of his vetoes have been upheld. However, this budget was very, very close to needing some Democrats in order for them to override the governor had he decided to veto the budget. Now, where are those Democrats? They are moderate Democrats, and there's one in the House and one in the Senate that reside in Cumberland County. So approximately Cumberland County itself got about $500 million in the budget, which should tell you a little bit something about how much money it would cost to give some people things that they could take home to their district so that they would vote for a budget, even if they might be a registered Democrat. So you saw some little tokens like that across the budget, but this one specifically is because both of those members too in Cumberland County really care about sexual assault and domestic violence, and they made sure that if they were going to get extra sexual assault, domestic violence funding, it was going to come to their home district. So our second priority that I covered is the rape kit backlog funding. So you may remember that in 2017, there was the big audit of rape kits in North Carolina, and we did have the most in the country, about 15,000 untested kits that were sitting around across North Carolina. And the General Assembly then provided $6 million to test those kits. $6 million was supposed to be enough. And then this year, the cost of testing kits went up. And so there needed to be an additional appropriation of $9 million to continue to test those kits. And there was also $1 million that was needed to support testing the kits. That's personnel, supplies, etc. And that was included in the final budget. Another one-time appropriation, but that does bring that total to $15 million that the General Assembly has funded in the past 4 years to ensure that the backlog is lowered. This next slide is a priority for both NCCADV and NCCASA. This was the child marriage bill. It was pretty heavily covered and followed. There was a conglomerate of organizations that worked on this, from a lot of child safety organizations to organizations like both of ours, where we were all looking to raise the age of child marriage to 18. So this was a curvy bill, I would say. It went through an interesting process to get where there was a compromise bill. And you're maybe thinking to yourself, why do we need a compromise bill? And the reason is because there are a lot of older folks in the legislature who, when approached about this issue, said, you know, my parents got married at 16 and they're still together. I don't see an issue with this. However, the data did show that that wasn't the general case, that generally it was a younger girl marrying older man. So in order to look at those cases themselves, that difference in age, the compromise bill said, if you're 18 or older, you can marry. If you're 16 or 17, you can marry if you have consent by a parent or guardian, and then remove 14 or 15 and 14 or 15 under special circumstances, and that includes pregnancy. No one under 14 can marry. It also sets a limit not being able to marry anyone who's 4 years or older if you fall into this age range. And that lines up with our statutory rape laws. Another priority that you will see does not have the green check over here is updating parental termination statutes to comply with federal guidelines. Like I said at the beginning, this would line us up with federal grants and keep us in compliance so that we could get those grants. It was included in a Senate bill that has a few different priorities in it, and it didn't move in the long session, but I saw that Vicky Pate was on this. So Senator Britt has given us some assurances that he's going to move this in a short session. We have some tweaks we need to make to that language of the entire bill, but we look forward to moving that with Senator Britt in the short session. I don't think we noted this at the beginning, but I will note that the short session, since we're still in the long session technically, the short session should start in about late April. That's generally the timeline, and then they should leave short session probably in July, definitely no later than Labor Day. This year was a little different with the budget, and it just kept going on and on. And right now there are some court cases over redistricting. So the legislators could return at any time to redraw maps for a couple weeks before adjourning and coming back in April. So once they are back in April, we're looking at kind of a tight timeline in order to pass other bills before they adjourn. But this is something we will be watching. And these slides do have hot links in them. Like this has a hot link for that bill if you want to take a look at the language. Another priority that I covered was SANE resources. I did see that Monica joined just a few minutes ago, and we did form a SANE working group. And like I said, there was that $125,000 appropriation for SANE training pilot programs in Cumberland County. And we do expect to get some data back from that, like how many SANEs were trained from that program, what the parameters of that look like, how exactly that's going to be implemented. I think that's information that is to come. But we had a working group that had SANE nurses, NCCASA, the Hospital Association, and other stakeholders in the meeting to kind of talk about what we needed to do to move North Carolina forward. Monique, is there anything you want to add to that?
No, I mean, not much else. I mean, still very much so ongoing conversations about it. It's a long road ahead, including both from SANE programs across the state, but also the policy side of things that could actually potentially positively impact what's happening. So it's, as Guy said, it's a little bit of both policy at the legislative level, but also individual hospital organization policy as well. So if you all will keep sharing what's happening in your local community, that certainly informs both our conversations with the work group, but also Sky's work at the policy level as well.
Yeah, thank you. Please do feel free to reach out to me about SANE issues if you have any. Looking ahead to the short session, some expectations, things I think that will be happening. I would say that we're going to have some high/tense political issues. It's an election year. Everyone in the General Assembly, all 170 members are up for re-election. They are elected every 2 years. And like Brian said earlier, we're not rooting for anyone. However, it is expected to be a tough year for Democrats. So we do expect the Republicans will gain a few seats in both the House and the Senate. That's public information. It seems like that's what may happen. Because of that, both Republicans and Democrats will try to turn out their base this year. So you expect some abortion, gun issues, other power struggles, maybe between the legislature and the governor, things like that to come up. And as those come up, I think both NCCADV and NCCASA may be involved in some of those issues, and we will be updating y'all on that. Every year, the purpose of the long session, which was the 2021 session, is to write a budget, and you're supposed to come back in the short session and tweak that budget. We have heard that folks felt like they did such a good job with the budget last year that they're really not going to be rewriting a short session budget, 2022 budget, that they will just be making those tweaks. In the past, it's been a brand new budget and maybe new spends, but that is not what we expect this year. We expect just small tweaks to that budget that we did see pass this year. Those high political issues are things that they will be running on, especially the leadership will be running on those abortion, gun issues for their base. And so we do expect to see more of that. I will say that if you have suggestions for language fixes that you're looking for, please do reach out to me. I know that I have been working with Amanda from Friend to Friend. I'm not sure if she's on here, but we have been working on some 50C changes. So if you have something that is glaring to you that you see that you want to talk to me about, feel free to do so. This is my contact and this is my phone number. I will let Kathleen take over, but we'll note when I was talking about those political issues that are coming up, we do expect to be working together this year to issue some joint statements as some of the issues that affect both domestic violence and sexual assault are covered. And if they are coming up in the General Assembly, we just want to do a better job of keeping y'all updated on what's happening and what we're doing from our organizational standpoint to be involved or make bills better.
All right, so I will pick up from here. If folks have questions for me or questions going back to Sky, please feel free to put them in the chat or just unmute yourself. If you want to go to the next slide for me, please, Sky. So as I said, I'm Kathleen Lockwood. I'm the policy director at NCCADV. Here is our legislative agenda for this past long session. And as you'll see, there are 2 things checked off here we're really happy about. And there are things that are not checked off. And those are items that we will potentially be picking up in the short session, along with some of these more political run-on issues that Sky mentioned. So if we could go to the next slide. So as Sky covered really well, the appropriation increases for domestic violence service providers and the one-time appropriations of $7.5 and $4.8 million that are going to also benefit domestic violence service providers were part of a joint effort between NCCADV and NCCASA to ask for these increased appropriations. Just a little more detail on the domestic violence side. That $500,000 a year increase in recurring brings the total funding for domestic violence service providers that are qualified under 50B's definitions to a little over $9.5 million. That $9.5 million includes the receipts for marriage and divorce fees in North Carolina. And we have in years past seen those receipts kind of slowly go down. This year, the receipts stayed exactly the same as the last budget. So we're not at least facing a cut in that way. We could go to the next slide. So these are some of the more direct appropriations that Sky had explained earlier in the presentation that are going to benefit domestic violence services or otherwise are related to the provision of domestic violence services in North Carolina. This first item is something that we talked about kind of at length in our membership meeting for NCCADV members earlier this fall. It started as a request for appropriation for $27 million for pretrial monitoring of domestic violence defendants in the House budget. After conference, the final budget included a little over $3.4 million a year in recurring funding for this pretrial monitoring. If folks are in a district where Caitlin's Courage is being piloted or implemented, the language here is very similar to the language describing that program. So it'll be monitoring of folks who are prior to conviction being monitored while their criminal cases are pending for domestic violence orders. So as you see that rolling out in your counties, if you have concerns about how it's running out or have questions about kind of the process and ways to maximize that for survivors, please feel free to reach out to us. Another recurring funding was added for domestic violence deputy clerks. This is not necessarily increasing the funding that folks are getting to help with e-filing. It's just supplementing some of funding that was lost in other areas. And then these last one-time non-recurring fundings are much more of those direct funding pieces that are either going based on a really specific ask that was made to legislators, such as in the Forsyth County Court Coordinator position, or it is appropriations that are in districts where those legislators are high up in the appropriations decision-making process and have a little more flexibility in how they can allocate funding. So even though some of these funds are not being, thinking about this last appropriation here, being distributed statewide at the same level, the fact that this appropriation is included at all is still a really good sign that folks making decisions about our budgets really value domestic violence services in their county. We go next. So the next legislative agenda item that we are trying to accomplish and have been is to increase filing access for domestic violence protective orders when courts are closed for either COVID exposure or inclement weather. We've heard from you all over the years, especially in 2020 with some of those court closures, that there will be situations where there's just a piece of paper on the door saying we're not accepting any filings today and go to a neighboring county or come back tomorrow. So we want to see if there's some kind of legislative remedy to make it clearer about what options really do exist for survivors when courts are closed suddenly, and potentially create opportunities for survivors not to have to travel multiple times to a courthouse or to neighboring counties to access relief in these situations. There's some language that we proposed that was included in Senate Bill 480, which is the same bill that Sky mentioned earlier in the presentation that Senator Britt has proposed to include multiple agenda items from victim services organizations. That's really just a starting place for some remedies that we're thinking about, but at this point we're talking about potential remedies to create on-call judges or magistrates to hear those protective orders. And we may see some progress in that in the short session, so be on the lookout for updates or requests for input about those possible options. So this agenda item has changed in a lot of ways since we had this similar meeting in November of 2020. So initially, our plan was to update the statutory language to expand relief options for same-sex dating partners trying to receive domestic violence protective orders. Gratefully, the Court of Appeals ruled on New Year's Eve 2020 going into 2021 that it is unconstitutional for our state law to not allow same-sex dating partners to request DVPOs just because of the fact that they're in a same-sex dating relationship. So since that ruling came out on New Year's Eve, it is legal and allowable and should be accessible for same-sex dating partners to get DVPOs. Now we're looking at a statutory fix, not to change the law, but to make sure that implementation of that legality is clean. So for example, the Administrative Office of the Court still has the same complaint forms and DVPO order forms as prior to that order that have opposite sex language when referencing dating partner eligibility. They've indicated that they do need that statutory fix to make it easier for them to update those court forms. So that's really what we're trying to accomplish now. We attempted that with House Bill 33, which many of you may remember your inboxes having lots of updates about earlier last year. That was a bill that really was just going to remove all opposite sex language from the qualifying relationship definitions in 50B. And unfortunately, as the House Judiciary Committee considered that bill, it really morphed into a totally different type of bill that included damaging language for survivors of all backgrounds trying to receive a 50B. So we ended up actually lobbying against that bill and were successfully able to keep it from passing the House as a whole and moving into the Senate. We're going to look at potentially different strategies starting at the Senate at this point to see if we can still get that statutory language in to help with implementation. There's also, I see in the chat, the question about the Supreme Court opinion, because that Court of Appeals opinion that came out on New Year's Eve was appealed all the way up to the higher courts based on the technicality, not based on challenging the concept that it's unconstitutional. Nonetheless, the courts are considering that. They had oral arguments on that case last week on January 5th. So it's just showing kind of the progression through the court system. There's no clear timeline on when we exactly should expect an opinion because they can issue opinions really quickly in a matter of a couple months, or they could take 6 to 9 months. However, that opinion will either confirm what we know from the Court of Appeals about the case showing that it's unconstitutional for same-sex dating partners to be discriminated against in accessing 50Bs, or the technicality that's being challenged could bring us back to square one in the court systems, in which case this statutory fix could kick in to say, hey, this is still the state of the law that same-sex dating partners could get DVPOs. So it's a little legally complicated right now, but the point that's important for you all to know is that it's undeniably legal for same-sex dating partners to get DVPOs. We're trying to help with implementation. Be on the lookout for updates from us in months to come about either confirming that from the Supreme Court or making that change statutorily, hopefully, to make it easier. And then one of the last policy issues on our legislative agenda that we haven't already talked about today is the issue of superseding orders. So you may be familiar with this from, I think, 2 or 3 legislative agendas at this point where we've tried to accomplish this. Basically, what we're trying to make clear is what types of orders and what circumstances will trump a 50B. Right now, as of 2019, the state of the law is that any court order that comes after a 50B that has similar provisions to something that's in the 50B will trump that order. We'd like to make it clearer and narrower so that we survivors can know what types of orders to be on the lookout for trumping 50Bs. We attempted to clarify it through statutory changes this session and previous sessions to make it so that only Chapter 50 orders, so like your family court matters like divorce and child custody, or Chapter 110, your child support matters, could trump a 50B. We haven't been successful in that. We have a sponsor, Representative John, who has filed a bill to that effect in the House multiple sessions at this point, and it doesn't seem like the committees in the House and the House as a whole is super supportive of narrowing this change. So it's still possible that there could be progress on this in the short session, but this isn't something that we're necessarily feeling as optimistic about championing moving forward. All that said, if this is creating problems where you are with survivors, I still want to hear about it because we want to make sure that we're properly prioritizing this issue in our legislative work. So other notable bills that came across our attention and used some of our energy this last session and may perk up again next session are House Bill 145. This was a bill that would expand the opportunities for storage of weapons that have been seized while a 50B is in place or pending. So right now, those firearms are stored in sheriff's departments solely. This law would allow federally licensed firearm dealers to also store those firearms if they have a relationship with the local sheriff's department. We've provided input on that, particularly on pieces of that bill that would have allowed firearms dealers to resell those firearms while the 50B is still in place. That bill progressed fairly far in the House, but did not ultimately pass the House this session and lead over into the Senate. But it is possible, since this is something that is a priority for other advocacy groups, that it could come back and we could have greater discussion or change based on that this session. And then this last bill is a bill that was filed in the Senate and didn't necessarily move yet. It's Senate Bill 101. It's very similar to House Bill 370, if folks are familiar, from 2019, talking about ICE cooperation with sheriff's departments. This is just another example of those run-on issues that Sky mentioned earlier that are really appealing to political bases across the state, and is something that we could be working on collaboratively with NCCASA in providing a response, just to make sure that any changes don't chill survivors of sexual assault or domestic violence from reaching out to help with law enforcement or the court systems moving forward. So Sky did a really good job explaining what to expect in the short session. So I'll just add to that to say we're going to hopefully continue some of our momentum on our legislative agenda items. We are also really open and want to hear feedback from you if there are tweaks that you would be proposing and seeing to be useful either in changing 50B or other laws that are impacting survivors. And we'll continue to issue those joint statements and provide input and make sure that you're up to date on how some of those run-on issues can impact the work that you're doing. To that end, New Frame has very graciously offered to provide a training and kind of discussion for NCCADV members on February 10th, specifically where we're going to get into a little more detail on power mapping the General Assembly. So identifying what legislators and what positions are really making some of the decisions on behalf of the legislature, and how can we make sure that they have the information they need and may want about the need for services and the needs generally of survivors in North Carolina. So this is your kind of first announcement. We'll make sure that you have the registration link in our weekly digest. You can also log on to your coalition manager page for NCCADV members and go ahead and register to attend that. And that is all for me. I'm going to check the chat real quickly and make sure there is not a question, but if folks have any questions for me or Sky, now is a great time to unmute yourself and let us know.
I do have one more thing that I did not include, but is something that if you get my policy emails, I know you have heard about. Right before the holidays, there was a ruling on Senate Bill 199 from 2019. We're very familiar with that bill. It created that mandatory reporting law, the new mandatory reporting law, It included a lot of NCCASA language in it for withdrawal of consent, incapacitation, loopholes. So that bill was really important to us. The part of the bill that was ruled on, it was ruled unconstitutional by a 3-judge panel, the look back period for child sexual abuse claims. So that look back period was 2 years and it ended December 31st, 2021, and said any claims that would have previously expired for child sexual abuse can be filed until the end of 2021. And a 3-judge panel ruled that to be unconstitutional, saying we can't go back and pull those folks in. There are a couple of other court cases on that particular bill, one saying that the bill itself is unconstitutional. And NCCASA has been involved in discussions about what's going to happen with that bill. One of the challenges says that institutions cannot be sued for knowing about child sexual abuse claims. And so we have been involved in strategizing what's going to happen, whether we're going to file a bypass petition and just go up to the Supreme Court. But similar to the same-sex DVPOs, that is something to watch for from us. We will keep you updated. You got my opinion or our statement on the opinion. And as it moves forward, we will keep you in the loop as to what's happening, because I know there were a ton of survivors who filed claims before the end of 2021. And I just want to mention that to keep on your radar.
And I just want to lift up a comment that Savannah made in the chat, an issue that they've identified of, to put it really briefly, custody courts not really taking seriously safety concerns of abusive parents when issuing custody, or kind of discounting abuse allegations and concerns and deciding how parents have custody of their children. This is something that we have heard from a lot of people and a lot of survivors that call the coalition. And there's kind of many ways to approach this concern. And we're also in a lot of conversations with national folks about how this is playing out across the country. So even though this is not showing up on our legislative agenda as a priority with a legislative fix, please know that we really appreciate hearing about this. And we are thinking and being creative in ways that we can hopefully make sure that judges have the proper training, and that survivors are fully prepared to enter into custody court with the best chances possible. And if there are any other questions or issues like that that come up, please don't hesitate to reach out to either of us. We really appreciate y'all taking the time to be with us today too.
Yes, feel free to reach out to either of us directly. Happy to talk through any issues you may have or any tweaks. We are readily available. And if the General Assembly is in session, Brian and I are down there. We're communicating with Kathleen. We are all on the same team here. So if you contact one person, it'll make it through our stream and be on our radar. So feel free to reach out at any time.
And if there are no further questions, we are very happy to give you some time back on your schedules today. I'm sure you all have great ideas for how to spend that, hopefully doing something nice for yourself. But thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next time.